Hello, everyone. Thank you for being with us today for History is Lunch in the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium. I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. If you have not already, please silence your cell phones. Don't forget that this Friday at 10:30 a.m. we'll have our Veterans Day ceremony in the museums. This is the second year for the program. It's a very moving moment for us all, and I hope that you'll make plans to be with us. And then the Mississippi Museum Store will have its holiday open house and special sale pricing on Thursday, November 14th from 4 to 7 p.m. The store, and most of you, of course, are familiar with it because they do the book sales here, but they feature folk art, local homemade crafts, and signed books by and about Mississippians. For the holiday open house, they'll be highlighting their Walter Anderson prints, Wolf Studio birds, Harold Miller sculptures, and Shearwater pottery. Museum members will receive a 20% discount on all purchases during that period. And this is really kind of cruel to do, but I'm going to do it anyway. It's lunchtime. There'll be samples of shrimp and grits made with Delta Grind stone ground grits, pulled pork sliders with Abe's barbecue sauce, white chocolate mousse with Nandy's candy caramel drizzle, and signature drinks from Mississippi Cold Drip Coffee and Tea Company. If that won't get you out, I don't know what will. And then I hope that you will join us here next week for History is Lunch. And this is normally where I would tell you a little bit more about next week's History is Lunch, but the truth is we've had the new book on the governor's mansion scheduled, but all of a sudden the governor is not available next Wednesday. So I'm not sure what we're going to do yet. We may have the book and have other folks and have that program, but we may have a different one. I promise it'll be good, and I ask for your forbearance on that, and I hope that we see you all next Wednesday. Today, we are delighted to have Vin Steponaitis, as he is presenting Fort Rosalie, A History in Maps. Vin Steponaitis is Secretary of the Faculty, Director of the Office of Faculty Governance, and William E. Leuchtenburg Distinguished Professor of Archaeology and Anthropology at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Steponaitis earned his A.B. from Harvard and his M.A. and Ph.D. from the University of Michigan. He is the author of dozens, if not hundreds, of scholarly articles and monographs, and the editor of Robert Neitzel's The Grand Village of the Natchez Revisited, Excavations at the Fatherland Site, Adams County, Mississippi, which was published as part of the department's Archaeological Report series. His current research includes the Feltus Mounds in Jefferson County, Mississippi, the Archaeology of Moundville, and the Archaeology of the Natchez Bluffs. Help me welcome Vin Steponaitis.
Thank you so much. I'm so delighted to be here because it gives me a chance to talk about two of my favorite topics, one of which is the history of the lower Mississippi Valley, and the other is French colonial maps. Now, I'll confess to you right from the outset, as Chris said, that I'm not a historian. I'm trained as an archaeologist, and most of my research has been on the ancient Indian cultures from this part of the world. I'm currently excavating a site in Jefferson County that dates to about 1,000 years ago. But in pursuing my research on the Indian cultures of this area, some time ago I learned about the value of looking at colonial era maps, because these maps that were mostly made by the French in the early 1700s and then by the English a bit later contain all sorts of really valuable information on the locations of the tribes and the native villages that were found in this part of the world. That's why I started kind of collecting these maps. I mean, literally collecting them. Most of these maps are in archives and libraries and museums, but over the last 20 years, a lot of these maps have become available in digital form. And where they weren't available in digital form, I visited the archive or the library or the museum and took scans or digital images. And over time, I amassed a pretty large collection of these maps, which actually a lot of them are online. I've got a website, if any of you are interested in maps, called Early Maps of the American South, that has a lot of these maps posted online. You can find it with Google. But in any case, so as I pursued my interest on the Indian cultures, I started collecting these maps. And you might wonder then, how did I get started on Fort Rosalie? Well, I happened to be at a conference in Natchez in 2011, and at that time, archaeologists from the National Park Service had started excavating what was left of Fort Rosalie in anticipation of kind of opening it up to the public as part of the national park at Natchez in time for the city's tricentennial celebration. And as these archaeologists were giving me a tour of the excavations, I asked them, well, do you know what part of the fort you're digging? Do you know where on the fort you are? And the archaeologist gave me an honest answer, and he said, well, we're really not sure. We don't know exactly where we are in the fort. And it occurred to me that I probably could figure that out from the maps that I had collected, from the maps that were sitting on my hard drive. So that same afternoon at the conference, I sat down and I started, putting these maps together. And by that evening, we'd sort of worked out the first version of what I'm going to show you today. So, this is something that kind of was serendipitous at first, but has sort of led to some interesting conclusions. And we now have a pretty good idea of where the Park Service was digging and actually which buildings they were finding as their excavations progressed. So what I'm going to do today is give you a talk in 3 parts, and then I know there'll be time for questions at the end. I'm going to start by just giving you a little bit of background and going through the maps, the various maps that have survived of Fort Rosalie at different stages in its history. And there were actually 3 Fort Rosalies that we'll see as we go through these maps. And then I'll show you how these maps relate to each other and how they relate to the modern landscape. We can sort of overlay these maps on each other. We can overlay them on a modern map and see what parts of the fort are still there and what parts of the fort have been lost through erosion over the years. And then finally, at the very end, I want to show you how old maps can be combined with modern technology to reconstruct and visualize a landscape that no longer exists today. And this is the landscape that existed in the 1720s when the French colonized Natchez. So that'll be the kind of plan for today. So let me get started by giving you a little bit of background. In a nutshell, the French colony in Natchez started in the early 1700s. La Salle, who was a French explorer, came down the Mississippi River in 1682, and he visited the Natchez Indians near what is now Natchez, Mississippi. And then things were kind of quiet for about 20 years. And in 1699, Iberville, another French soldier, discovered the mouth, or located the mouth of the Mississippi River, and the French started moving upriver. And by the early 1700s, in the 1700s, there was already a missionary, a Catholic missionary priest who was based at Natchez, and French started sort of filtering into the area, and the colony really sort of got off the ground in the 1710s. So in the early 1710s, a trading post was established, and in 1716, the first iteration of Fort Rosalie was built. Now, the colony continued to build, and it really sort of reached its peak in the 1720s. And virtually all the good maps we have of the colony date to the 1720s. And then in 1729, it all came to a crashing halt. The Natchez Indians decided that they had enough of the French. They attacked the colony, destroyed the colony, and that started a war between the French and the Natchez that lasted through the 1730s. But in any case, let me now start by showing you some of these maps. And I'll start with this picture. Whenever you read a history book or you see an exhibit on the history of Natchez and you see an old map of the French colony, chances are it's a map that was drawn by a French soldier named Dumont de Montigny. And these are 2 scenes of Fort Rosalie from 2 of Dumont's maps. Now Dumont, the one thing I can say about Dumont was he was not a stickler for detail. Most of his maps are drawn, if you imagine yourself on a balloon, if you were in a hot air balloon over the river, kind of looking down at the colony at an angle, at an oblique angle. He drew 4 large manuscript maps. He drew them, he was trying to curry favor with French aristocrats. He was always trying to kind of move up in the world, so he'd make these spectacular maps and send them to someone who he hoped would be a kind of a sponsor or a patron. And if you compare his maps, no 2 are alike. They all have sort of roughly the right idea, but they all differ in details. And in a way, it's not surprising, because even though, at the outset he wasn't a stickler for detail, All of his maps were drawn 20 years after the fact. He lived in the Natchez colony in the 1720s, but most of his maps and a long memoir that he wrote about his adventures there, all that happened in the 1740s. So a lot of his maps are drawn from memory, and again, they're not great on detail. They sort of show roughly what the place looked like. You can see the elevations of the buildings, but in terms of locational information, they're not really very useful. Now this map right here is an entirely different story. This is a map that was drafted by another military man named Ignace Francois Brutin, who was just a first-rate military engineer. He spent 1722 and 1723 mapping the Natchez colony in detail. I think all he had was the equivalent of a Brunton compass and a chain, and he must have walked every inch of ground in and around Natchez and produced an incredible map. The map itself is about 6 feet wide and 3 feet high. It exists in an archive in Paris. And later, Brutin wrote, he actually made this map kind of as a contractor for the French trading company, and he never got paid. And so there was litigation over it, and in that litigation, he's quoted as saying that he lost his health and his youth while making this map. But in any event, this map is so good that you can, just by following the streams, you can actually take it and just lay it right down on a modern map of the topography of Natchez. It's incredibly accurate. And this map, fortunately, there's a little detail that I've just outlined down below, has the area around Fort Rosalie. And so this is the first depiction of the fort that we see in a map. Oop. Here we go. Let me get the pointer. So you can see it's a square fort with a bastion on each corner. Not a lot of detail in this map because it's so zoomed out. But this is sort of what the fort looked like in 1723. It was a wooden stockade with 4 bastions and 4 buildings inside, those little red dots. Now, that's 1723. In 1729, war breaks out between the Natchez Indians and the French, and the colony is destroyed. Virtually all the men were killed, women and children, and the African slaves were taken captive by the Indians. Very few people escaped that attack. A few men who happened to be near the river when the attack happened, floated downstream to New Orleans, let the folks in New Orleans know about this, and anyway, what happened in 1730 is Brutin, the same engineer who drew that 1723 map, was sent back up to Natchez to sort of figure out what to do next. And during that visit in 1730, he produced this map, which is a kind of a detail of the area around the fort. So let's zoom in on this map. So I'll first zoom in on this area. What he mapped was the outline of the old fort. Now, by this time, this fort had been burned. I mean, it had been destroyed the year before. One of the bastions was already gone, and then there were a whole set of buildings around the fort. So he sort of mapped what had been there but was now destroyed. And he also, let's zoom in a little closer. Okay, there it is. There were 4 buildings. These were the barracks. There was an officer's quarters, a magazine, and a guardhouse at the gate. That's the guardhouse. That's the magazine. That's the officer's quarters. Some of you can read French. You'll see that Brutin had been the commandant at this fort up until about 1728. And while he was the commander of the fort, he kept writing letters to his superiors saying, "We've got to fix this fort. This fort is falling apart." And when he comes back in 1730, after the Natchez attack, after the French colony is destroyed, this legend that goes with the map is kind of his "I told you so." And basically one of the things he says is that the walls of the fort were so rotten that anybody could just walk right through them. And most of the buildings in the fort, Merchant Barak is kind of a rude hut, a sort of a really crummy building. So anyway, but all this had by this point been burned. The other thing he did, and we've just zoomed out a little bit on this map, is he showed another fort. This is essentially, he called it the provisional fort. Essentially, the French were now faced with having to put a garrison back in Natchez, but the fort that would have protected the garrison, that would have housed the garrison, was now burned to the ground. So he found a landform. There's this long finger of land that reaches out, and the form's kind of a natural fortification. It's got steep bluffs on three sides. It's very narrow on the fourth side, and so what he proposed was that this little peninsula of bluff be fortified and serve as a provisional fort with a moat that's dug there, and then sort of the slope of the ground forming a natural barrier on three sides. This is another plan that he drew of this provisional fort, and this is where the garrison stayed temporarily until the new version of Fort Rosalie could be built. This map, which is from one of the archives in France, was always a mystery to me. It didn't look like anything, any of the sort of recognizable iterations of the fort. And eventually I realized this is a map of the provisional fort. It's just sort of an odd map. Here's that little peninsula, here's the moat, here's the buildings just beyond the moat. It doesn't show it as connecting with anything, but the date and everything else fits. So this is a more detailed map, but not a very well done map of that provisional fort. So that was the second version of Fort Rosalie. The first one was the stockade, the square stockade with the four bastions that was burned in 1729. The second version was this provisional fort that was kind of on that naturally fortified peninsula of land. And this is the first depiction we have of the third iteration of the fort, and the one that survived for the longest period of time. Bruttin was sent back again in 1732 to rebuild Fort Rosalie. And he was a consummate engineer. He decided that these wooden stockades weren't worth a whole lot, that the wood rotted and wasn't going to last very long in the climate and soils of this part of Mississippi. So he planned out a different kind of fort, a pentagon that would be protected by an earthen embankment surrounded by a moat. And this is his plan of the new fort that would be built to replace Fort Rosalie. And a lot of that construction started in 1732. This is an anonymous map. I don't think Bruttin made it. It's kind of not in his style, of the fort while it's under construction. And it's color-coded. You can see that the yellow part, these are cross-sections of the embankment and the moat, and there was a stockade outside the moat. The parts that are in yellow are the ones still to be built. So you can see this is how much had been built, and that yellow part is the projection of what still has to be done. So this is under construction, and it's really interesting because it has the camp of the construction crew there. The French contracted with an Irishman. They call him Sir Darby, Mr. Darby. And Mr. Darby brought a bunch of black slaves, and this is the slave camp. This is Mr. Darby's residence. This is the hospital. And so this sort of shows the fort and the associated buildings where the crew lived as the fort was being built. So we assume it's undated, but this should be about 1732. And then we have this drawing by a Frenchman named de Batz that is dated at 1732. This also shows the fort under construction, but in cross-section. So you see here's the embankment, the moat. He's got a Frenchman on top, which I'll show you in a minute in more detail. So this part of the fort is built, but here they're still trying to get this part constructed. And you see he's got these great figures of French soldiers standing on the embankment, standing outside the palisade with a swivel gun. Let me go back. He's got a swivel gun right there. And the National Park Service, when they excavated the fort, found a cannonball that the size and shape is exactly what you would expect for something that was fired by a swivel gun. So we've got some archaeological evidence that fits with this plan. So the French rebuilt the fort as a pentagon, a kind of a pentagonal embankment surrounded by a moat, and they occupied the fort up until the 1760s. And in 1763, at the conclusion of the French and Indian War, this territory, including Natchez, was ceded by the French to the English. So the English essentially take possession of the fort, at least on paper, in 1763. The French garrison goes away, but it took the English 2 years before they could get anyone up there. They had tried in 1764 to send a detachment of troops upriver to visit the fort, and that detachment was attacked by the Tunica Indians in the area around West Feliciana Parish, and they turned back. And it wasn't until 1765 that an English detachment made it up to Fort Rosalie to see what it looked like and to map it. And so this is the map on the left is the manuscript map that was made by Captain Pittman, the English officer who went up there. And so this map is done in his hand. It's a manuscript. And then 5 years later, Pittman published a book about the expedition, and this is the engraved version of the map. And they're very similar. But you can see that what he did was he sort of mapped what the fort looked like. He talks about it in his accounts. It's in rough shape. I mean, the French had abandoned it. It had been just sort of sitting there for a few years. But he could still make out the features. So that pentagonal embankment is still there. He could see the gardens that the French garrison had used as a source of food. There's a stable and a bakehouse. So the stuff was all still there, but it was in rough shape and needed work. So in any case, soon after Pittman's expedition, soon after he made the map, the English reoccupied the fort. It's basically the same pentagonal embankment that had been built by Broughton in 1732. Here's a detail of it where you can see what the fort looked like. Then we get into the Spanish period. By the 1790s, the Spanish had taken control of this territory. And some of the best-known maps, 18th century maps of Natchez and of the fort, came out of an expedition by a French officer named Collot, Victor Collot, who was... he was billed as a tourist, but he was really on an intelligence gathering expedition to sort of see what the fortifications were like along the Ohio and the Mississippi rivers. So he went downstream and reached the Natchez area in 1796. And a number of manuscript maps and one published map exist as a result of this expedition. These three are different versions of manuscript maps that are drawn by hand. This is the one that was published, and the account of his expedition, which happened in 1796, wasn't published until 1826. By that time, Collot himself had died, so his account was published posthumously. But these are the contemporary maps that were made during and in the immediate aftermath of that expedition. And the thing that if you walk into a house in Natchez and somebody has an old map of Natchez on their wall, it's usually this map right here. And the thing that is distinctive to me about all of these maps is how terrible they are. Remember that fort is a pentagon, and on this map it's shown as a six-sided thing. Yes, Natchez had a grid of streets that were established in the Spanish period, but it doesn't, that's not a very good, it's almost like just a schematic depiction, not really an accurate map of the street grid. So these maps are not particularly good, and actually when you look at the history expedition, it's easy to understand why. Collot himself, even though he was trained as an officer, was not the engineer on this venture. He brought another officer named Joseph Warin, who was his cartographer and his engineer. And in the earlier stages of this expedition, as they're floating down the Ohio River and then down the Mississippi, they map a whole bunch of places that they visit, and those maps are great. They're really accurate maps. The Natchez map is pretty awful. And I think the reason is that Collot's, it was a small expedition. They had like 6 people in 2 canoes. They were attacked by a group of Chickasaws near Memphis, and Wareen was gravely injured. He was injured with an axe, a tomahawk, and by the time they got to Natchez, he was still alive, but he was so gravely injured that I doubt very much he could get very far from the canoe. So what probably happened is that Wareen, who was the cartographer, never made it up the bluff to Natchez, and somebody else went up there, drew a sketch map, and then later that became this map. And Wareen later, they eventually reached New Orleans, and Wareen died while they were in New Orleans. But this is a kind of a detail of the map, and again, you can sort of see that. I mean, it doesn't really accurately depict what it looked like. It's kind of like one of Dumont's maps, where you just sort of get a general sense of what's going on, but not a really accurate depiction. This is another drawing that came out of that expedition. This is a view of Natchez looking from sort of up from the river, and this actually is pretty good. And my guess is that maybe Wareen did draw this. I mean, if he was injured and he was in the canoe, he could have drawn this map or this view. But again, that's only speculation. This is the published version, and this is the original manuscript that exists in the French archives. This is the fort right here, and this is the Spanish governor's house or government house off to the left. And then you've got some houses here down in Natchez under the hill. So now that we're in the Spanish period, we're in the 1790s, the Spaniards laid out the street grid that you still see today in Natchez. And a whole lot of, people started moving into the place, and there's an awful lot of land surveys that exist from that period, from the 1790s, as people are subdividing land, buying it, selling it, and so forth. And a lot of the cadastral maps, the maps that show the land subdivisions, will show the Natchez street grid, and usually they have the fuerte, the fort, off to one side. And the first thing you notice about the fort in most of these Spanish period maps is that the Spanish changed the fort. They added bastions. So you almost always see those kind of bastions at the corners of the Pentagon. Here's another detail from one of these cadastral maps. Again, you have the fuerte on the bluff edge with the bastions. And then this map, which shows, again, made by a Frenchman named Lafon, who was a really good cartographer, showing what the fort looked like in 1794. And you see the 5 bastions that have been added to the fort, and also this structure called the hornwork, an extension of the fort that the Spanish also added. So the Spaniards really sort of expanded the fort. And then fast forward to one more view. This is I think this is Audubon's first oil painting. It's a view of Natchez that he made in the winter of 1822 and 1823. It's not clear exactly what it might have been at the very end of 1822 or very early in 1823. This is, if those of you who know Natchez, he's standing on a ridge that no longer exists that would be right on the approach to the bridge, the Mississippi River Bridge that leads to Vidalia, Louisiana. And so imagine being sort of high up above the road that leads to the bridge, looking north across Natchez. And what you see on the left side, that's Fort Rosalie, that's the embankment. So in 1723, that embankment was still there, pretty much intact, right on the bluff edge, and it doesn't stay intact for very long, and we'll get to that in a minute. So that is the sort of record of the different kinds of maps we have to work with. But the question is, where were these forts on the modern landscape, and how did the different forts relate to each other? We know, for example, that they rebuilt the fort in 1732, but was it right on top of the old fort? Was it next to the old fort? You know, these maps, just looking at them one at a time, don't really answer that question. And there's no single map that shows both the old fort and the new fort on the same map. So how do we sort of figure out where, well, we can actually see a piece of the new fort, the one in 1732, it's still there, so we know where that was. But where was the old fort, the 1716 fort, in relation to the 1732 fort? So the answer to that question lies in the maps, and it lies in the fact that Brutin, who was a great engineer, when he came back in 1730, showed the location of the old fort. And he drew it on a kind of a base map of the bluff topography. You can see sort of the different elevations here that he depicts with shading. And then 2 years later, he comes back and draws a plan of the new fort. And what lets you correlate it is he's using the same base map. So you see that he's got, there's the bluff edge with that notch. Here are these lobes that show the elevations. And I'll just flip back and forth. See, the base map matches. So using that as a guide, we can put the 1732 map, line it up with the 1730 map, and that, in effect, lines up the two forts. So we've got one map placed on the other based on the topography. Let's outline the embankment, and then do that trick you see magicians do, where they've got a table that's set with a bunch of plates, and they pull out the tablecloth, and the plates are still there. Let's pull out that map, and there you go. So now what we have here is the new fort, outlined in red, sitting on top of the old fort that's on the base map, and you can see that they built the new fort directly on top of the old fort. We didn't know that until we were able to line up the maps. So now we sort of know that the new fort, and we know where the new fort is in relation to the old fort. Where are these forts on the modern landscape? So this is a topographic map of the bluff edge where Fort Rosalie is located. And this is a map that is made with a technology called Lidar, where an airplane flies overhead, bounces laser beams off the surface of the Earth, and makes a really accurate map of the Earth's surface. And Lidar can penetrate trees. And this bluff edge, by the way, up until recently was just heavily wooded. So and nobody had really mapped it by hand with surveying instruments, but this Lidar map shows the topography. And so here's the bluff edge that, going down steeply to the river bottoms below. And here's this kind of rise, which is believed to be what's left of Fort Rosalie. When we take that outline, scaled the same way and with north, aligned, you can see that this topographic feature is about the right size, shape, and orientation as the southeast part of the embankment. And it lines up really well. And so we can pull in Brutan's map under it and draw in this dotted line is the bluff edge. You can see that what's left of the fort is only this sort of southeastern portion, whereas all of this is now gone. And ditto, if you take away the new fort and you look just at the outline of the old fort, what you see is that if this is the bluff edge, this is the part that remains, and this is the part that is now gone. So there's still, a lot of it is gone, but a lot of it is still there. Now, the part that's left, if you believe this map overlay, are these two buildings, and these were the barracks for the soldiers. And Dumont, in his sort of bird's eye view depictions of the fort, draws the barracks. They look like this: single-story buildings, multiple entrances, which is very typical for French architecture of its day. And another way to sort of correlate the fort with the modern landscape is to use those Spanish maps that show the Natchez street grid. This is a view of Natchez in Google Earth. You can pull those Spanish maps into Google Earth, line up the street grid on the Spanish map with the street grid that you can see today. It's the same streets, exactly the same grid. And when you drape the Spanish map, aligning the streets with the modern streets, there's the Fuerte, and what you see is that Fuerte just kind of dropping off the edge. And so again, it fits. What we've got is just that southeast bastion, or southeast embankment, that's left. And so now we sort of know where the new fort is, we know where the old fort is, we know where it fits on the landscape. Let's look in more detail. Let's look at those same maps that are now kind of geo-referenced with the modern map of Natchez and see what we have, see what we can figure out. So here's the Lidar map of the area along Canal Street in Natchez where the fort is. Here's in red the embankment, and so you've got the little remainder back here. And I'm going to draw in the bluff edge so we can see where that is, and then we'll just go through these maps in turn, looking at where the bluff edge is. So again, we've looked at these. This is Brutan's 1730 map. Oops, let me go back. Don't know why that jumped ahead. I must have pressed the wrong button. Here's the map showing the fort under construction, and the camp. All this is gone, but the camp of Mr. Darby and his workers should still be there. Here's the English map. This garden is gone, but the bakehouse and the stable and all that are still probably exist in the ground in the part of the site that's left. And the Spanish version with the hornwork, I don't have a slide of this, but actually this piece of the hornwork, I think you can actually still see it in some of the topography that is there today. So some of the fort is still there, most of it is gone. One more question that we tried to figure out is, when did we lose the fort? In 1723, in Audubon's painting, you can see the whole fort is still there. But today, of course, only that southeast corner of it is still up on the bluff. And Natchez, those of you who've been there know that those bluffs over the years keep eroding. Until they stabilized it about 20 years ago, pieces of the bluff kept falling off due to erosion. And as I looked through the histories of that area, trying to figure out when it happened, the first clue I found was in Claiborne's History of Mississippi, which was published in 1880. And Claiborne says that the fort was there, most of the fort was there until the Great Landslide, and that took away most of the fort. But he gives us no clue as when the Great Landslide was, everybody in the 1880s knew about the Great Landslide, so we didn't have to explain it. And over again in the 1780s and the 1790s and the 1880s and the 1890s and the 1900s, there's just all these references to the Great Landslide, but they don't tell you when it was or what it was. And it took a while, but I finally figured it out. Here is an account from 1869 in the Natchez newspaper. In May of 1869, a big hunk of the bluff sloughed off, and people referred to that as the Great Landslide. And there was a whole series of articles about it after the fact in the Natchez newspaper. It occurs, mentions of this landslide occur in newspapers all around the country. Here's a brief mention in the Daily Picayune in New Orleans. But I think pieces of the fort had fallen off by the 1860s, early 1860s, but 1869 is when there was just a big landslide and most of the fort went down into the river. It caused quite a swell in the river and made an alarming noise. So that's when we lost, I think, most of Fort Rosalie. So what I want to do now is just finish with something that'll sort of give you an idea of what the Natchez colony looked like in the 1720s. And it sort of shows you what you can do when you combine old maps with modern technology. And so what we have, here are the pieces of the puzzle. We have the modern landscape. We know what the modern landscape looks like in great detail with this Lidar data, this mapping data that you get from the laser technology. And so we have the modern surface of the Earth with Lidar. We have this map by Brutan that I showed you at the very beginning that locates all of the buildings in the fort with great precision. He gives us the locational information, but not a lot of details on the buildings. The buildings in his plan just are little red dots showing where a building stands. The location is good, but you can't tell what the building looks like. To tell what the building looks like, we turn to Dumont's maps. Dumont's maps are terrible when it comes to location, but he shows you that sort of bird's eye view where you can see the side of the building. You get a sense of what the buildings look like. So by taking The modern Lidar data, correcting it for the bluff edge that is sloughed off, we can sort of extend the bluff edge out using the French maps. The locational information that you have in Brutin's 1723 map, and the information on what the buildings actually look like from Dumont's maps, one can put together essentially a 3D model of the 1730 French, or 1723 French colony at Natchez. And this work was done by one of my graduate students, Ashley Pellis. And so what I want to do now is switch from the slides to a video that she made that sort of shows the landscape and sort of lets you fly over 1723 Natchez.
The town of Natchez, Mississippi celebrated its tricentennial, traced back to August 3rd, 1716, the date when the French finished building Fort Rosalie. What would Natchez, Mississippi have looked like around that time? Combining the 1723 landscape survey of Ignace Francois Brutin and the map depictions of Jean-Francois Benjamin Dumont de Montigny, we can put together an approximation of what the early settlement of Natchez might have looked like in the early 1720s. This flyover provides an approximation of that Natchez settlement, bringing back to life a landscape that no longer exists. The topography of the landscape is based on current Lidar of the Natchez area. Lidar maps are based on the use of laser scanning, where height is measured based on the amount of time it takes for a laser signal to hit the ground and bounce back up to its source. Using a series of Natchez maps, Dr. Vin Steponaitis of UNC Chapel Hill aligned Brutin's map by matching up stream locations. Once Brutin's map was accurately located, it could then be overlaid on top of the Lidar map. We know that much of the bluff line along the Mississippi River has changed, so Brutin's designation of the bluff extents were used to raise the bluff line back up to its previous location. While Brutin's map provides landscape contours and building locations, he does not show us what the French buildings looked like. For that, Dumont's maps were essential. Using the combination of Dumont's building depictions, evidence from archaeological excavations at Old Mobile, and other early French fort reconstructions, an approximation was made for the appearance of early 18th century French buildings. As we come over the first pass-through by the fort, you can see that Fort Rosalie appears to be in quite good condition. This means that what we're seeing is how the fort might have looked shortly after it was first built. As time marched on, the condition of the fort deteriorated, and in 1729, Brutin claimed men could simply walk through the rotted palisade walls. As we come over the side of the bluff, we circle around the company storehouse, where goods and rations would have been stored. This building was owned by the Company of the Indies and probably served as a trading post for the settlement. Coming back around to the fort, we can see some of the buildings that Brutin and Dumont depicted on their maps. There were 2 barracks buildings that housed the soldiers, a commanding officer's house, a guardhouse, and the magazine, which held the fort's weapons. In hindsight, it would have been prudent for the company to heed Brutin's pleadings about the fort. On November 29, 1729, the Natchez Indians attacked, killing around 230 colonists and burning the fort and French homes to the ground. Ultimately, the French in New Orleans regrouped and, along with Choctaw allies, retaliated against the Natchez Indians, capturing hundreds of people and selling them into slavery. While the French did rebuild their settlement, with the destruction that happened in 1729 and all the changes in the centuries since then, this 3D landscape represents our best reimagining of the early French roots of Natchez, Mississippi.
Right. So with that, let me just show you one more slide as I close. This fort, when I first went to Natchez in 1972, and the area where the fort was just a thicket of vegetation, just heavily grown up in trees and kudzu. And in 2016, during the year of the Natchez Tricentennial celebration, the National Park Service, which had by this time acquired the property, basically cut away the vegetation. This is a picture I took at the Tricentennial in the summer of 2016, and they had just cleared that embankment, and you can just, for the first time in all the years I've been going to Natchez, you could actually see it. And it's there, it's beautifully landscaped now. If you're in Natchez, it's right along Canal Street. It's really worth a look. And I hope that when you go visit Natchez and look at what's left of Fort Rosalie, you now can imagine what the whole fort looked like, what the area around it looked like, and know that under that embankment are still preserved the remains of those French barracks that were built in 1716. So let me stop there, and I'm happy to take any questions if you have any. Thank you. Yes, sir. I think the microphone will be passed around to let you ask the questions.
My understanding is, this is a beautiful presentation.
Thank you.
My understanding is that there was a great tornado that came through and leveled Natchez, and at the time, New Orleans was smaller than Natchez was, and that marked the decline for a while of Natchez and the ascendancy of New Orleans. And I wonder if that process had any effect on your investigations, like loss of records or something like that.
So I'm aware of that tornado. I think it was in the 1840s. I just drove up here from Natchez. I've been in Natchez the last 2 days, and the subject of the tornado came up as we were talking about some of the buildings in Natchez that are in that Audubon painting, that one of the buildings in that was destroyed in that 1840s tornado. So, but I don't, it really, most of the records that I deal with are in France. So for the purposes of just what I've talked about, that tornado had almost no effect. But of course it was a very important event in the history of Natchez. So that's all I know about it. Any other questions?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Thanks for that very enlightening presentation. The Rosalie settlement. One of the problems was that the French wanted to extend the boundary of the settlement, and that because they tried to extend it into what was considered traditional Native American territory, we have conflict, confrontation, violence, war. Because they're trying to, the Europeans, whether they're French or Spanish, trying to extend the settlements that they have established. They're trying to extend it, push the boundaries further, and of course, pushing the Native Americans further off their own traditional territory. To what extent was maps used to push the settlements, extend the boundaries of the settlements into Native American territory, their ancestral homes, because they're established homes there for centuries and centuries and centuries. And now we have Europeans coming and settling and establishing maps and establishing areas that they consider to be their own private property. And then they use maps to extend these territorial or these places that they occupy. So my question is, to what extent was maps used to extend European territories into Native American ancestral settlements?
So the short answer to your question is that they were used in that way a lot, and in part because the Europeans, they didn't really, in many times, recognize native control over land. They saw it, as a competition. The English and the French were competing for areas of influence, spheres of influence, and there's a whole literature among historians of cartography about how the French and the English used maps to sort of argue over who controlled what. And of course, in that argument between the French and the English, the Indians don't really play any role from the standpoint of the Europeans who were engaged in that argument. Now, with specific reference to the maps that I showed today, the interesting thing to me is that the Brutan map, well, let me just go back a step and say that in the 1720s, there were the Natchez Nation was divided into 6 towns that were sort of components of the Natchez Nation. Each town had its own chief, and they were confederated under a paramount chief who lived at the Grand Village of the Natchez Indians, the place that's now a state park in Natchez. It's clear from the history of that period that the towns had different views of the French. The French were actually living literally side by side with the Indians, in part because they were invited in by the Indians initially. On that Brutan map, he marks French houses and Indian houses, and they're somewhat separated, but they're kind of intermingled. So initially, the French were invited in, and the towns that were in the immediate vicinity of the French settlement were the towns that were the most friendly to the French. But there were 3 other towns that were located a little bit farther out, not much farther out, just a few miles farther out, who clearly were much more hostile to the French. And the interesting thing to me, when I talk about that Brutan map, I use the analogy of Baghdad after the Iraq War, where there was a kind of a green zone in Baghdad that was the safe place for American troops and diplomats to be, and if you went outside the green zone, it was no longer safe. Brutan mapped the green zone in 1723. That map includes just the area around Fort Rosalie and includes the kind of friendly towns. But the less friendly towns, they're off the edge of the map, and maybe that's because Brutan ran out of time, but I suspect it also was that he was mapping the areas in which he felt the safest. So I guess that's the best answer I could have to your question, but it's a good question. Any other questions?
Hello?
Yes.
I'm glad he raised that question because the presentation seemed to focus primarily on the topography and the fort. Mm-hmm. I remember reading in history that the French were more friendly with the natives that were other explorers. But a question in my mind as you were going along is, what's the real significance of Fort Rosalie? I didn't get that.
Okay. Well, the significance was initially, the Natchez colony was sort of one of the real strongholds of the French in the Mississippi Valley. Natchez was founded before New Orleans, and Natchez, that colony, and I'm talking from the French perspective, was kind of at the heart of their strategy to sort of gain control and colonize that part of the Mississippi River. So when that war broke out in 1729 that destroyed the colony, it was a real blow to French colonial aspirations in that part of the world. So that's a short answer to that question. But also keep in mind that I'm one of the reasons I'm interested in this question and the approach I'm taking is that I'm really interested in the archaeology of the fort. And this exercise of sort of overlaying maps and trying to figure out where these different iterations of the fort are is a way of opening a window into future research that we can do, trying to understand better the lifeways of the people who live there. And there are archaeologists who work on the French side. My own archaeology is sort of working on understanding the native cultures that existed at that time. So you're right that there's a lot of things I didn't touch on. And in a way, keep in mind that my view of this is a kind of an archaeologist's view to try to understand where these different archaeological sites are located. Yeah. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry, there's someone.
I just want to mention as a kid growing up in Natchez, our parents didn't realize we snuck down to the fort site. There was the remnants of the 1940 replica that was built there, and we climbed up in a tower. Since then, probably the day after, probably caved off the edge.
You were lucky to be here.
It was a little shaky, and so when they were saying they weren't exactly sure where the fort was, of course I was convinced that's got to be it because I played on it. But also you mentioned I forget the term you used, the substitute fort when they came back.
The provisional fort.
Provisional fort. Was that on the ridge where Audubon looked from, or was it up on the bluff where the hotel is sitting now, south of the bridge?
So as you know Natchez, so I'm going to give you an explanation that you'll understand, but maybe not everyone in the audience does. As you go from where the fort location is on Canal Street toward the bridge, as you get just past the fort on your way to the bridge, there's a railroad track there. And that railroad track goes sort of down the bluff to the river, sort of under the bluff.
Right.
And that incline along which that railroad track runs as it goes down toward the bottoms, that it's running along that long, narrow ridge where the provisional fort was. So that railroad, if there had been anything left of that provisional fort archaeologically, it was probably destroyed when they built that railroad spur.
That's what went to the ferry to take the railroad cars across the bridge. That was the track.
Right.
And you mentioned, archaeology of the bluff. I think in the 1820s, there was a lighthouse north of this fort site, I believe, on the bluff.
That's right.
Above where the casino is now, that caved off. I originally had thought, well, it must have been destroyed by the 1850 tornado, but I found where it was lost to a cave-in as well.
So so there have been, if you look at newspapers from the 1800s, you can get online now. I was talking with Joe Miles Seeley, who's digitizing newspapers from Mississippi. I've been all over those newspapers, and when they're digitized, you can do a search. So when you search for landslide in Mississippi newspapers, Natchez newspapers from the 1800s, you get a lot of hits. So there was constant landslides, and lots of bits and pieces were lost along the bluff. But by the late 1800s, people are saying it was the great landslide that took most of the fort. So I'm taking them at their word. I will also say there's an 1864 Union Army map of Natchez, where I've done the same overlays, and you can see that in that 1864 map, a piece of the fort was lost, but most of it was still there. So I think some of it had been lost before 1869, but I think the 1869 landslide is the one that took most of it.
On the Demond maps, there were, it looked like there was a squat kind of bullet-shaped down here. Is that a cave or something along the bottom?
I think, now I'd have to look more closely at the original map, but I think what that is on one of his maps, he has this like an oven. I mean, these things, his maps are not to scale. They're sort of like cartoon maps. And I think that's probably what that is, but I'd have to sort of look at it more closely. That's my guess. Any other questions?
Is anyone doing any work on the Darby camp, the workers?
I think that the Park Service, after I did those overlays, went back out there and they did some excavations in that general area, but I do not know if they have confirmed that or not. I just haven't heard yet. Yes?
Well, we have come to the top of another hour, I'm afraid, but I bet then we'll be glad to answer any questions anyone may have after the program. This was fabulous. It's a good opportunity to remind folks that we have an email list over there, and if you are already on it, then look for an email updating you on next week's program. Come back, it'll be fabulous, whatever it is. And Vin will be back with us, along with archaeologists from the University of Mississippi and staff at the Grand Village in the spring to talk about findings and recent developments at the Grand Village. And so if you're on the email list, you can certainly keep up with our schedule that way too. Thank you all for being with us today. Help me thank Vin Steponaitis for his fabulous work.
Thank you.